morning. My name is Debbie Bevin, and I am the Historic Preservation Specialist for Disaster Recovery in the North Carolina State Historic Preservation Office. And today I am going to be talking to you about the main federal disaster assistance programs that are available to all people, but especially how they apply in historic districts in North Carolina. So we will get started. I'm going to start with this image from a flood in Fayetteville in 1908. So as we know, floods are not new. They seem to be increasingly common in North Carolina. This is from a postcard, and the title on it says Masonic Lodge during the freshet of August 28th, 1908 in Fayetteville. And I think that's a beautiful word for something that really isn't so beautiful in reality. So I'm going to be talking about three government programs, three federal programs that you may or may not be familiar with. One is the National Flood Insurance Program. FEMA is another one. That's the one that probably is most familiar to you. And finally, there's a U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development program through the Community Development Block Grants program. We're going to start with flood insurance. National Flood Insurance Program is a partnership between the federal government and communities that have been identified as having special flood hazard areas. FEMA has a relationship to this program. FEMA makes affordable flood insurance available in communities that agree to adopt and enforce floodplain management regulations. Within those communities, all property owners, whether or not they purchase insurance, are required to abide by floodplain management regulations and ordinances that are adopted by their local government because of their participation in the National Flood Insurance Program. At the core of these floodplain management regulations and ordinances is a requirement that new construction and substantially improved or substantially damaged properties must be elevated so that the lowest floor is above base flood elevation for that site. Base flood elevation is defined as the elevation of surface water during a flood having a 1% chance of occurring in any given years. And that is frequently called the 100-year flood, but flood authorities are trying to get away from that term because, as you all know, we've had a number of 100-year floods in the last 20 years. So it's a little misleading. The other terms I need to identify are substantially improved or substantially damaged, and that basically means that greater than 50% of the value of the property is calculated to be damaged or improvement. So if you spend more than 50% of the value of the property on your repairs, it's considered to be substantially damaged or substantially improved. The National Flood Insurance Program does allow for special consideration of historic properties. It's important to know that owners of historic properties may request a variance from some of the requirements of their local ordinance. To make this request, it first requires a historic building certification from the SHPO, from the State Historic Preservation Office. There is a link on our website to a specific form that you need to complete requesting certification, and I will give you that citation a little later. Our office will certify that a building is historic. It could be in a National Register Historic District or in a locally designated district. But this is important. Local governments are not required to issue variances and, in fact, are discouraged from doing so by the flood insurance program. And I need to say that regardless of whether a historic property owner requests or is granted a variance, Mitigation measures to minimize future flood damages should always be considered when historic structures are rehabilitated or are repaired following a flood or other hazard event. Can determine you can find out a lot of information about flood risk in your area and for your particular property by going to the North Carolina Flood Risk Information System. My colleague Andy is going to demonstrate this in his presentation, which will follow mine, but here is the web address for it, and you can search by address and you'll find out your base flood elevation, your estimated risk, estimated damage in a flood, and you can get flood insurance quotes. And here also is a link to our website, and if you go to our disaster response section, you'll find the application for historic building certification. And finally, it's important to contact your local floodplain administrator for questions about the particular ordinance in your community. So the Federal Emergency Management Agency, it's part of the Department of Homeland Security, is the agency that we think about first when we hear of a hurricane or other major disaster. FEMA assistance is triggered by a presidential declaration of a major disaster. I don't know if you have any of you live in areas that were affected by Hurricane Dorian, but recently the way that process worked was that local and state agency people assessed damage, made an estimate of damages, and made a request to the president for a declaration of a major disaster. And that was granted only partially for Dorian, but I will get a little more into that in a bit. Now, there are three main components to FEMA's assistance, three different ways that they provide assistance following a disaster. First is individual assistance, then there's public assistance, and then there's hazard mitigation, and I will be talking about all three of these programs now. Individual assistance is intended to address damage to residences and businesses or personal property loss. It includes disaster housing, which is temporary housing immediately following a disaster. That might be in a motel, or it might be FEMA sometimes installs temporary trailers for people to live in. Individual assistance also includes low-interest disaster loans from the Small Business Administration, which was surprising to me when I learned that, because I thought that the Small Business Administration would only provide assistance to businesses. In this situation, you can apply for an SBA loan to cover uninsured property losses to homes or businesses. And these loans do have income and repayment requirements. Finally, individual assistance includes disaster grants, which are for those people with no other financial resources or who are unable to qualify for an SBA loan. Public assistance, and this is the only kind of assistance that North Carolina will be getting for Hurricane Dorian, is intended to be used for infrastructure repair, public facilities, and debris removal. And it generally pays for 75% of approved costs, so this kind of funding requires a state or local contribution. This third main program is hazard mitigation, and hazard mitigation's purpose is to encourage disaster victims and public entities to avoid the life and property risks of future disasters. This is the future planning component of FEMA's work. And their focus is the acquisition and demolition of chronically flood-damaged houses in flood hazard areas. These are the houses and buildings that get flooded over and over again. The other way they mitigate future hazards is elevating buildings above base flood level. And my colleague John is going to be talking a little later about the many issues that are raised by elevating buildings. There's lots of tricky issues, especially in historic districts, but even when they're not, like this one, the questions you want to ask are, how high does the house have to be raised, and is it livable at its new height? How is the foundation going to be treated? How will you access the house? Can you use landscaping to soften the appearance of the foundation? And most importantly, for the purposes of certified local governments and historic preservation commissions, how does the elevation of one house or many affect the streetscape of a district? Finally, I'd like to talk about a disaster recovery program that some of you may not have ever heard of before. This is from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development and its Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Funds. It's sort of a mouthful. CDBG funds have long been used to encourage redevelopment in communities, particularly focusing on low and moderate income housing. But there is a special kind of CDBG funding specifically for disaster recovery, and it has been a big part of North Carolina's disaster recovery programs in recent years. The focus of CDBG funding for disaster recovery is on long-term recovery efforts. It's intended to address unmet needs, to supplement and fill gaps. The funds must be used for necessary expenses related to disaster relief, long-term recovery, and restoration of infrastructure, housing, and economic revitalization. Since this is last resort funding, new applications for CDBG disaster recovery assistance are still being received for Hurricane Matthew, which occurred over 3 years ago. Similar to the FEMA programs, HUD funding is broken down into 3 different sections. There's housing recovery, which includes activities that lead to restoring and improving the housing stock, including both rehabilitation and new construction. Community recovery and infrastructure, which are activities that rebuild or replace impacted infrastructure. Examples of that include road and bridge repair, water and wastewater facilities, and buildings for the general conduct of government, like public buildings, community centers, libraries, and schools. And finally, HUD has just published notice of $168 million in disaster mitigation funds, which will be primarily used for community recovery for North Carolina, which should become available in mid-2020. This is the first time that HUD has allocated funds specifically for mitigation, which has traditionally been under the purview of FEMA. The State Historic Preservation Office plays a role under Section 106 in these federal disaster recovery programs. Amber mentioned Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act to you, which directs federal agencies to identify historic properties, determine if they will be affected by a federal undertaking, and consult with the SHPO on how to avoid or minimize adverse effects. So in terms of disaster recovery programs under our office's environmental review responsibilities, we have established broad programmatic agreements for individual declared disasters with FEMA, the North Carolina Department of Public Safety, the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency. And these agreements provide a framework for our Section 106 responsibilities in relation to particular storms. They might include ways for us to expedite our review. They might exempt certain activities which we know are not likely to affect historic buildings, and they lay out how we're going to consult with the federal agency to minimize impacts on historic buildings. We also conduct project-by-project review of federal disaster assistance activities and, as I said, consult to minimize adverse effects to historic properties. And we try to assist in planning for future events so that aid can be delivered more efficiently in the future. The Certified Local Government and Historic Preservation Commission can also play a role in some of these disaster assistance programs. Before a disaster ever happens, you could consider amending your design guidelines to address elevations. You could educate homeowners about storm prep and floodproofing options. And after a disaster, you could provide guidance on repairing and drying out historic buildings. And of course, you'll need to review and issue certificates of appropriateness for the elevation, renovation, or reconstruction of properties in your local historic districts. Amber mentioned we are giving quiz questions throughout our presentation today. This is to enable you to get credit for training. And my question is, what are the 3 big types of assistance that are available through FEMA? And you can email your answers to her, or you can include them in the notes, the comments on the YouTube presentation. That concludes my presentation. Here is contact information for our office, both for me and Renee Gledhill-Early, our Environmental Review Coordinator, as well as our website, which is where you can find that historic building certification application and GIS maps that my colleague Andy will be talking about next. Thank you very much.